different experience for me. I'm quite used to being face to face with people when doing presentations. So please forgive me if I stumble or if I kind of reach out every now and then and try and find a little bit of a response. But quite exciting to be able to talk to you. I'm very excited to be talking to you about cart abandonment and how things can change in that particular space. We've got 20 minutes, so it's a relatively quick session. So I'm not going to be able to delve too deeply into some of the concepts, but I do encourage you at the end to kind of reach out if you've got any specific questions and get in contact with me and we can discuss a little bit more deeply. There are three key things that I'd like to discuss today as I kind of open up the presentation here. And it will open up in a second. And those three concepts that I'd like you to keep in mind are, one, the market is changing. Every year and every time I talk to people, people always have this kind of idea that the market that we deal with is always the same. But the reality is that every year there's new entrants and there's people leaving the market, either because they retire, they die, whatever. And there's new people coming into the market because they've graduated from school, they've entered the economy, they're starting to purchase. So you've got to keep that in your mind all the time. The second is that the market is increasingly becoming less and less comfortable with the idea of credit. People are starting to see that the big four banks or the big banks around the world have all these really big fancy buildings, and they're starting to think, well, hang on, where's that coming from? Is that coming from the money I'm paying them? And well, are they overcharging me? And the third concept that I'd like you guys to keep in the back of your mind as we have the discussion today is that if you put cash into your customers' hands, they're going to ultimately spend it with you. And so when you take all of that together, you'll start to see how we're looking as Payflex at how to decrease a cart abandonment. So if we have a look at the research is going to tell you a few things. The research will come back, and this is a study that was done in 2019 by the Bayman Group, and it'll tell you these things, and you can check these things off, and you can go and build your sites on the back of this, and you can help yourself make some deliberate changes to these particular strategies. But what we're seeing is, if you go back to the three starting principles that I spoke about, is that things are happening slightly differently in the market. The first big thing that we're seeing happening is that the concept of the millennial, and when I throw that word out, everybody will always start going, hang on, millennials are these young guys. But let's take 2 seconds to ponder what a millennial is. Is it a person that is just entering the workplace now and is up to the age of 25? No, the millennial is actually people up to the age of just under 40 now. So millennials make up a very large percentage of the buying force that's in the online market today, around 25%, and that grows every year. And this is a group of people who are seeing the world differently. You know, one of the interesting stats out of one of our parent shareholder companies is that people are more likely to search for how to cut up your credit card than how to apply for a credit card at the moment. And that's being seen more and more on a day-to-day basis in terms of how people are transacting. The first thing that we're seeing is that people are now starting to have use debit cards more than they are using other cards, traditional credit cards. The next thing that's interesting in the South African context is that millennials now make up around 15 million of the total South African population. And that number obviously will grow year on year. There are about 3 million of this millennial category that have no access to traditional credit because they just don't have a credit history. That's the one side of what we're seeing in the market. The other side of what we're seeing in the market is that merchants are living in an environment where they've got higher cart abandonment, and the economy is becoming more and more fragile. In fact, I mean, I don't have to tell any of you what we're all going through right now, but that it just displayed how fragile the economy really is. But the interesting thing that we're seeing through our business right now is that even though there's lockdown all over and people are told that they can't shop, there's still a lot of transactions taking place on a day-to-day basis. In fact, just one of the surveys that I saw the other day from one of our competitor companies shows that baby products online have increased 500% in terms of sales. We're seeing an increase in the amount of sales happening in general fashion, and that's even considering that people can only get these goods after the lockdown has ended. So there's still lots of trade and lots going on. Now, when we start pulling all these pieces together, and I go back to that third principle that I was talking about earlier, if you're able to put cash into people's hands, they're going to spend it with you. There's two companies internationally that have learned this about 5 years ago. A company called Afterpay coming out of Australia, and then a Dutch company called Klarna coming out of Stockholm. And these two companies have worked out quite quickly that if you approach credit very differently, in fact, if you flip the credit model on its head and you don't charge interest to the consumer actually ends up with more money in their pocket in the long term, and they end up spending that with you, the retailer, at the same time. As you can see from the slide here, these markets have grown quite considerably in a relatively short period of time. Klarna sits with just over 60 million customers worldwide at the moment, and Afterpay, they're now transacting in both Australia and New Zealand, and they've moved to the States, and they've had some massive growth in all of those locations. What is the product and what have they brought to the market that's making all this change? Well, it's something called buy now, pay in full, or buy now, pay later. And it's a concept that we've brought to South Africa, and we've seen some great strides early on. And I'll take you through some of those case studies just now. But basically what it says is that if you go to your customer and you allow your customer a payments plan, that then allows them to have more money in their pocket, which allows them to spend more money with you, the retailer, at the end of the day. Now, that's not always possible because you've got to find a way to cash flow that, but that's where a company like Payflex comes in, and we're able to give you immediate settlement and allow your customers to do the payment to us over the 6-week period of time. But basically, because we do it this way, we're not seen as a credit provider, we're seen as a payments plan, and that allows us to move through the process relatively far more quicker than what you would do in a traditional lending environment. So let's take as an example, a traditional lender. If they wanted to provide credit to one of your customers, it's going to take them anywhere between 24 and 48 hours to be able to go back with an answer on a new account to your customers. Whereas in our particular case, we're able to do that in 6 seconds. Now, I don't want to turn this into a bit of a sales pitch around Payflex. What I want to do is just give you the concept that if you're able to allow your customers that ability to spread their payment over time, they're able to buy more with you for two key reasons. The first key reason is that in the interest scenario, if they lent 1,000 Rand, it's going to cost them anywhere between 1,200 and 1,500 Rand over the term of that loan to repay. That's 200 to 500 Rand that's lost from your pocket and lost from their pocket in terms of their spending power. If they are able to spend the same 1,000 Rand, but spread it over 6 weeks, which effectively turns into 2 pay cycles for the customer, they are then in a position where they have that additional 200 to 500 Rand in their back pocket to come and spend with you again. Now, the kudos that you get as a retailer, being able to offer that to your customer, means that the customer remembers you helped them out and they come back and spend money with you. Whether they do that in that initial transaction with you or they do it in a follow-up transaction, they do end up spending that with you. The next 2 slides are really just to give a little bit of credibility around Payflex as a customer. So when we get into the case studies, you understand that this is not kind of case studies done on 1 or 2 small retailers and we've chosen the best stats so that these things look great. But the reality is we've been around for a while now, and we've been operating with a whole host of retailers and being able to show the power of the buy now, pay later concept that we brought to South Africa. In terms of case studies, 3 key case studies from around the world. The first is a case study right out of South Africa from a company called Holster Shoes. Holster Shoes, they sell vegan shoes, believe it or not. It took me a while to figure out what vegan shoes were, but basically it is shoes that don't harm the world when they're being produced. Holster is a company that comes out of Australia as well. And they focus on selling fashion shoes to the female market largely. Their shoes are sold online. They don't have any physical stores at the moment, and they've been doing relatively well. We introduced the Payflex product into their stores about 12 months ago, and we've been tracking the performance of that, and I think the numbers all speak for themselves up there. But effectively, we've seen the average order value in the holster space increase by 21%. We've seen that the average shopper in the holster environment will now increase the number of shops that they do or the number of orders that they make by 5.5 times. So as you can see, being able to give the customers that ability to manage their money in their way, they are feeling more empowered and they're spending more money with the merchant at the end of the day. Now, that's not an isolated case. If we look across the world, we turn to Afterpay, one of the original guys who started this particular process, and you look across a number of their different retailers, you'll see similar kind of stats coming out. And this is, again, coming back to a 22-23% increase in sales. Now, that increase in sales is not coming through just purely because people are shopping more. It's because they're abandoning less carts. Our experience in South Africa has shown that we will reduce the cart abandonment to around about 30%. And that's driven purely because the customer now sits with a position where they have that much more money in their pocket. And it goes back to answering some of those questions that the original survey that I showed you talks about. One, it says they can now start predicting their money spend a little bit better. They know they've got the ability to afford the delivery charges that are being put into the transaction. And two, they're also being able to say, well, hang on, I could have only spent 1,000 Rand on one item, but actually now I can spend 2,000 Rand across a number of items because I've got time to pay that off. And don't underestimate this whole idea of immediate gratification. My partner in the business, Paul, he often talks about the fact that psychologically, someone knowing that they don't have to pay 1,000 Rand today, they only have to pay 333 Rand today, makes it that much easier for them to kind of say, well, let's just spend a little bit more on this transaction. So those kind of things play together to mean you have less cost abandonment and a slightly higher spend. I think as a whole, that gives you a good sense of what's happening in the Payflex space and what we're driving. The key principle that I'd like to kind of repeat, and so I've kind of dotted off my slideshow there quickly. The key piece that I'd like to kind of reiterate to everybody is the market's changing. It changes on an ongoing basis, and keeping your ear to the ground and making sure that you're aware of what your customers are doing and asking for is primary importance. Secondly, you've got to focus on the fact that your customers are not trusting the traditional banking environment as they were in the past. And it's time to flip that whole model on its head and find a way to provide them with a payment plan like a Payflex to be able to give them more options in terms of the way they check out, the way they spend their money, the way they manage their money. And the last concept is going back to that whole concept of saying, if you're able to put cash into their pockets and keep the cash in their wallet, they're going to spend that money with you or some other retailer. It's a normal human behavior to spend. It's the normal human behavior not to save to a large extent. And so people are not going to keep that money in their pockets forever. And they're going to spend it with you, which is going to drive your business to better and better heights at the end of the day. That's the formal part. We've got about 4 minutes left. And so we've got an opportunity to open up for a couple of questions now. I assume everybody's got the ability to throw out some questions. I see there's a question here. In order for the 4 months payments, do you get the details up front in order for you to split that amount over 4 months? Just a quick correction there. It's not a split over 4 months. We split the payment over 6 weeks. So it's 4 equal installments that we do in terms of the transaction. Yes, we do require a credit check that we do in the process, but as I mentioned earlier, to do that credit check, it's like 6 seconds. Our approval rate around 65%. and then we will immediately either accept or pass the person back to a pay now option, and then the transaction flows through. We settle immediately with the merchant, and then we start to collect the funds from the consumer or the client. You dispatch the goods immediately because you received your payment, and then the customer is happy because they've got their goods quickly. They've also got this experience that says they haven't had to lay out the full amount before they get their goods, so they know they're getting their value at the end of the day. How do we, next question that's come through is, how do we manage bad debt, especially now with people not paying at all? A very good question. Bad debt is something that we manage through a number of different avenues. One, we are particular about the merchants that we bring on. So we make sure that we're not bringing on merchants who are online gaming, for example. And when I say online gaming, I'm talking about proper gambling. We won't, we'll look to stay away from merchants who are involved in particular industries where it's easy for the person to consume the good very quickly and have no desire to pay for the good thereafter. So there's a little bit of social management that's involved in that. We have credit models that we refer to as well. So we run the credit scores and we go to the credit bureaus. We are able to identify particular high risk or low risk customers. And then lastly, we have collections protocols where we're able to go out to the customer and do the collection from them. So we manage all of that quite tightly. I hope that answers that question. Going back to more questions, there's a question about, can this be used with food companies? Yes, it can. Obviously, we look at different payment limits in the food company spaces. And also the tenure that the customer has been with us or been with you. So absolutely can be used in the food space. The next question that come up here is, how is the account set up with the client company which signs up with you? Is it a card payment or normal accounts? We work very much with debit and credit cards. That's the way we work off the back of the credit card rails. So we're able to do the collections off the cards on a monthly basis. Waiting for any more questions. I think we've got about a minute left. If there's anything else. Can we use this in the automotive sector for batteries? Absolutely. We've got quite a few customers using the Payflex product in the automotive space, both in terms of customer detailing all the way through to customer repairs. So, for batteries, we do quite a lot in the tire space as well. So absolutely, we can use this in the battery space. There was a question earlier around merchant fees. These fees are negotiated merchant by merchant. So volume of transactions and size of base and those kind of things do factor in. So it's a little bit difficult to give an absolute answer in terms of rate. Cool. I've been given the please finish up from the organizer. So thank you for listening.